Hello, my name is Henry Silverman, and in this presentation, I would like to discuss the different categories in which research can be classified by the Research Ethics Committee. I would like to thank Mohammed Abdullah and Reed Abu Hamadan, past trainees of the Moretti Training Program, for developing this presentation. When a protocol is presented to the Research Ethics Committee, the chair or his or her designee should first review the protocol to determine the following: whether the protocol can be considered human subject research, or more specifically, is it considered research, and if so, does it also involve human subjects? If the answer is yes, then a determination should be made as to whether it can be considered exempt research. A classification of exempt research confers certain advantages. Essentially, the investigators need not report any future adverse events to the Research Ethics Committee, need not submit continuing review reports, and need not report to the Research Ethics Committee any administrative changes. If the protocol does involve human subjects and cannot be considered exempt research, then the protocol needs to be reviewed by the full board of the Research Ethics Committee. Now, why should the Research Ethics Committee determine whether a protocol can't be classified as not involving human subjects or can be classified as exempt research? To answer this question, one should review that embedded in every research experiment is a balancing of two values. On one hand, you have the advancement of science, but such a goal needs to balance against that of protecting subject welfare and their rights. Abuses have occurred when the goals of science overrode the concern for the protection of subject welfare and rights. However, there are certain types of research that does involve little or no potential for causing harms to subject welfare and rights, such as research that, from a regulatory point of view, does not involve human subjects or can't be classified as being exempt research, and hence the rigor with which such research needs to be reviewed and monitored by the Research Ethics Committee need not be all that involved. Classification of research into these categories is important from the vantage point of enhancing the efficiency of the workload of the REC. For example, in a recent study that reviewed the research proposal submitted to the WHO for funding, 6% were classified as being non-human subject research, and another 22% was determined to be exempt research. Accordingly, these protocols would not need to be reviewed by the full board of the Research Ethics Committee and would not need continued monitoring by the Research Ethics Committee. To review, the first question to ask when a protocol is submitted to the Research Ethics Committee is whether the proposal can be considered research and whether it involves, from a regulatory viewpoint, human subjects. What I mean from a regulatory viewpoint will become clearer in just a few minutes. Research refers to a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. The two key words in this definition include systematic and generalizable. Systematic refers to a well-thought-out plan to collect data in such a manner that can answer a hypothesis. Hence, an activity that includes the collection of data from one patient, as occurs in a case report, is not considered research. The other key word in this definition is generalizable, which means that the results of research can be applicable to other settings. Hence, if a hospital is collecting data to determine the quality of its services, it is more likely that such results will not be applicable to other hospital settings, and hence, such quality and assurance activities are not considered research. If a determination is made that the protocol involves research, then one needs to determine as to whether the research involves human subjects. Research involves human subject when it involves living individuals about whom the researcher obtains data through an intervention or an interaction, or obtains identifiable private information. Examples of interventions include laboratory testing, obtainment of a CAT scan or a liver biopsy, which are all performed to obtain data about human subjects. An example of an interaction would include surveys or interviews. One obtains identifiable private information, for example, from a chart review or processing of tissue samples. However, if the data are de-identified, or if the data are publicly available, then even though the data are about human subjects, it is not considered human subject research. Essentially, de-identified data cannot cause harms to individuals, although in certain cases, such data might cause harms to an ethnic group. Also, if the data are considered publicly available, usually the research will not cause additional harms than what is already existing. Let's now go over a few examples. Case 1 refers to research involving autopsy specimens. A research application describes the following proposed research activities. An investigator receives autopsy specimens from a pathologist at the same institution. The investigator will receive and record identifiable private information about individuals obtained from the medical records. Is the investigator conducting human subject research? From a regulatory point of view, the answer is no. The reason is that the research is involving only specimens and data from deceased individuals, and also the investigator is neither interacting nor intervening with living individuals. Hence, the definition of a human subject is not met. As alluded before, certain types of research may need to be considered human subject research even when the data comes from deceased individuals. For example, if there might be harms to family members or to ethnic groups, as might occur in genetic research. Case 2 involves discarded tumor specimens. An application describes the following proposed activities. Investigators will obtain human specimens for basic research from a pathologist who has previously collected tissue specimens from cancer patients for diagnostic purposes, not for research purposes. The pathologist will de-identify the data before giving it to the investigator, and there is an agreement that the pathologist will never reveal the identities of the subjects. Are the recipient investigators conducting human subject research? The answer is no, because the investigator have received de-identified data, and there is no way that they can ever gain access to the identities of the sample. Essentially, we say that the samples have become anonymized. The next case involves discarded surgical specimens. An application describes the following proposed activities. Investigators want to obtain human specimens for basic research from a surgeon. The surgeon will collect prospectively surgical specimens that would otherwise be discarded and provide these specimens in a coded fashion to the investigators. The surgeon will have no other involvement in the proposed research. What do we mean by coded data? Essentially, coded data refers to when identifying information has been replaced with a number, a symbol, or a letter, and a key to the code exists that links the information to an individual. Essentially, the key enables the investigator to readily figure out the identity of the individual. In this case, is the recipient investigator conducting human subject research? The answer is yes, because the recipient investigators can readily link the specimens to the living individuals. Also, the surgeon is involved in human subject research because he is interacting with living individuals and collecting specimens for the proposed research. Case 4 involves retrospective record review. An application describes the following proposed research activities. An investigator obtains individually identifiable information on treatment outcomes of patients who had been treated with 2 different approved drugs by accessing the stored medical records. The investigator records the treatment outcomes in a coded manner. In other words, one could still readily identify the human subjects associated with the data. Is the investigator conducting human subject research? The answer is yes, because the investigator obtains individually identifiable private information about living individuals, and the investigator records the data in a coded manner, allowing the subjects to be identified via the code. Now, if the investigator records the data without identifiable information, then one could categorize the research as exempt research. Exempt research will be the subject of the next few slides. When we talk about exempt research, we refer to the research that is exempt from full board review and also continuing review by the Research Ethics Committee. A decision to categorize research as being exempt may be made only by the chair or his or her designee and not by the investigator. Also, the decision must be done in advance of the research. Finally, there must be clear determinants of what qualifies for exempt research, and these determinants is what we'll discuss in the next few slides. The first rule for all exempt research is that the research to be considered for exempt status must not involve vulnerable subjects, such as prisoners and children. And also, the research must not be more than minimal risk. The first category of exemption involves research conducted in commonly accepted educational settings and involving normal educational practices, such as research on special education instructional strategies. Also, research on the effectiveness of different educational strategies or the comparison among different instructional techniques, curricula, or classroom management methods. The second category of exemption pertains to research involving the use of survey procedures, interview procedures, or observation of public behavior, unless information is obtained and recorded by the investigator in such a way that the subject can be identified and disclosure could reasonably place the subject at risk of criminal or civil liability or be damaging to the subject's financial standing, employability, or reputation. I like to emphasize the conjunction "and," meaning that the information needs to be both identifiable and could place the subject at reasonable harm. The third category of exemption pertains to research involving the collection or study of existing data, documents, records, pathological specimens, or diagnostic specimens. If these sources are publicly available or the information is recorded in a way that the subject cannot be identified directly or through identifiers linked to the subject. We need to be clear by what is meant by existing data. Essentially, existing data refers to data that have already been collected at the time that the research has been conceived. In other words, the existing data had been collected previously for purposes other than the proposed research. It applies to retrospective studies in which the data are already on the shelf. An algorithm for what we have been discussing is presented in this slide. First, one determines whether the proposed activity is considered research. If yes, then one determines whether the activity involves human subjects from a regulatory point of view? If the answer is no, then there is no need for full board REC review. If the answer is yes, then one asks whether the proposal can qualify for exempt status. If the answer is yes, then there is no need for full board REC review. If the answer is no, then the protocol needs to go for full board review. To make sure that we understand fully these concepts about exempt research, I invite you to look at the case studies that are on this module, and I thank you very much for your time.